Chapter 1. Scary Stories. Michael Rose had been working for the Lancashire Police for 7 years. He loved his job. Because he lived and worked in a small village, he knew many people by name. Even though he was only 33, he was an old-fashioned type of policeman. Friendly, caring, and ready to help. He liked the people of Pendle Lee, and the people of Pendle Lee liked Sergeant Rose. Crime was not a big problem. At the police station, days went by quite slowly. Many other officers liked to be in a bigger town or a city. But Michael loved being part of a small community. The village itself was also a lovely place to live. The church, which was in the centre, had been built in 1376. Many of the houses had been standing for a very long time. Even the pub, which was called the White Witch, was hundreds of years old. At the edge of the village, a river flowed through the fields and woods. On summer evenings, it was as beautiful as a painting. However, there was not very much for young people to do. Bored teenagers were often getting into trouble. In fact, most of the problems Michael had to deal with were caused by teenagers. Loud music, graffiti, and bad behaviour were the main things. Usually, he just talked to the young people and their parents. He hardly ever had to take one of them to the station. In 7 years, he had only arrested 5 people. Yet in those 7 years, he had found 11 lost dogs and returned them to their homes. Some policemen would have found that kind of life boring, but Michael was happy. It was the middle of summer. The sun had just set, and it was very late. Michael was at the police station. He was on the night shift. For a few hours, he had been doing some paperwork. Even in a small village station, there was a lot of bureaucracy. He had also had some coffee and had read the newspaper. The police station cat, Harriet, was sitting on his knee. She was purring. "Sorry, Harriet," Michael said. "You're going to have to move. I want another coffee." He tried to push the fat, tabby cat off his lap, but she didn't want to go. Suddenly, the phone rang. That's strange, Michael thought. Nobody ever called late at night, unless something was really wrong. He picked up the phone. "Pendle Lee Police Station," he said. "Oh, Michael," said a voice he recognised. It was Mrs. White, an elderly lady who lived on the edge of the village. "I'm sorry it's so late," she said, "but there's something happening in the cemetery." Michael sighed. Every now and again, a group of teenagers would gather at the Pendle Lee Cemetery. Wearing black clothes, they would light candles and play loud music. "Is it those kids again?" Michael asked. "Maybe," Mrs. White replied. "I can't sleep, and it upsets me that they go to the graveyard. My parents' and grandparents' graves are there." "Of course," said Michael. "I'll go right away. Then maybe you can get some sleep." Around 10 minutes later, Michael parked the police car at the cemetery gates. He could hear music. The yellow glow of candles told him where the kids were. He got out of the car and switched on his torch. Next to the gates was a very old house. In the past, the cemetery caretaker had lived in it, but the place had been standing empty for 20 years. Some of the windows were broken. Climbing plants had grown over the building. They had even gone through some of the windows. 200 years ago, it had been really pretty. But now it looked like something from a scary movie. Nobody went inside. Birds had made their homes in the empty rooms. Using his torch to light the way, Michael went towards the teenagers. Lots of candles were glowing on the graves. There was loud music, and some of the teenagers were standing in a circle singing. When Michael appeared out of the darkness, he frightened some of them. A girl nearly screamed. "Sorry," he said to her. "It's only me. Are you trying to make a ghost appear?" "It's none of your business," said a tall boy. He stepped forward into the torchlight. Michael knew who he was. His name was Alex. He was 17 years old, and his parents owned the bakery. "It is my business," Michael replied. "This is a cemetery. It's an important part of this community, and having a party here isn't respectful." The girl who had nearly screamed came across to Michael. "We can do what we want," she said. She was trying to sound brave after her fright earlier. Michael recognized her now. Katie Lewis. She was only 14, and she should have been at home in bed. "What are you doing?" Michael asked. "Are you trying to make contact with witches? I don't think you'll have any luck tonight." Pendle Lee was in a part of Lancashire that was famous for its witches. In the early 17th century, some women and men from the area had been arrested. It was said that one talked to a black dog that was really the devil. The villagers believed that witches had made some people sick and even killed them. It was believed that cows stopped giving milk because of magic spells. The unlucky women and men were kept in prison at Lancaster Castle. The witches had been hung in 1612. Many people went to watch. Now the witches were seen as ordinary people who were scapegoats of the community. But the stories had continued until the present day. The Lancashire witches brought many tourists to the area. People could buy toy witches. Lancaster Castle even had a special tour of the old prison rooms. And every year, on Halloween, people from all over walked up Pendle Hill in the dark. Pendle Lee had its own stories too. Some were about the cemetery. The first graves were over 700 years old. Long before the big Pendle Lee church was built, an even older church existed where the cemetery was. The stories told of witches meeting at the place where the old church once stood. It was said that they danced around large fires and tried to see the devil. The ghost of a witch called Agnes Cott was said to haunt the graveyard. Some people said that the caretaker's house was haunted too. Strange noises were heard late at night. Strange lights were seen too, even when the teenagers were in their beds. Michael switched on his torch again. "Time to go," he said to the kids, "before the ghost of Agnes Cott really does appear. Then you'll all run screaming back home anyway." "You can't stop us," said Alex. "We'll come back again." "The more this community hates us, the happier we are." "I'm sorry you feel that way," said Michael. He did understand. There was nothing for teenagers to do in Pendle Lee. He thought that young people's discos at the church hall were a good idea. The villagers were worried about noise and alcohol. However, having teenagers on the streets at night was a bigger problem. After the kids left the graveyard, Michael looked around. There wasn't any graffiti on the graves tonight. In the past, there'd been a problem with graffiti. Even some of the headstones had been smashed. That was a few years ago. Alex and the other young people were angry and bored. But Michael didn't think they would do anything that bad. He decided to keep an eye on them anyway. A few days later, Michael was on a normal afternoon shift. He liked to work during the day because there was more to do. He could walk around the village and talk to people. He could stop by the different shops and chat with the owners. At the station, other officers would come in from time to time. Even Harriet the cat liked the daytime best. On sunny days, she could lie on the step outside the station. Anybody coming in or going out would have to step over her. Mr. Murphy, an elderly man, had called in at the station to give Michael some beans. Mr. Murphy had grown them himself in his allotment. He was always stopping by with fresh vegetables. Like many older people, he used his allotment for pleasure rather than needing the food. He grew more than he could eat. Michael was just admiring the fresh green beans when his mobile rang. "I'll just get that," Michael said to Mr. Murphy. He put the beans down. The call was from his boss, who had an office in the city. "We've just heard from the Oswald Gallery," the chief inspector said. "They called the national emergency number. Can you go there, Michael? They've been burgled." Michael switched on the sirens as he drove quickly through the village in his car. As he drove, he thought about the gallery. He hadn't been there for over 3 years, but he used to go a lot. That was because his ex-girlfriend, Sarah, loved art. Sarah had left to go to America about 3 years ago. She worked in art restoration and had been offered a job in Boston. After thinking long and hard, she decided to take it. But Michael couldn't get a job with the police in the United States. He didn't want to stop being a policeman either, so he stayed in Pendle Lee, and Sarah moved to Boston. The Oswald Gallery was just outside the village. It was in a beautiful 18th century house. A man called John Oswald had built the house, and the gallery was named after him. It took Michael around 10 minutes to get there. When he arrived, he walked to the door. 2 elderly women quickly came to meet him. They looked upset. Both of them started speaking at once. "Oh, Sergeant, thank goodness you're here," one of the women exclaimed. "I'm Joan Potts. I work here." "We don't know how it happened," the other lady was saying at the same time, "but it's my fault." "No, Lottie, of course it's not your fault," said Joan. "Yes, it is," Lottie exclaimed. "I'm so angry with myself." Michael raised his hands. "Let's stay calm," he said. "We'll go inside, and you can tell me all about it. Then we'll start searching for the thief." Chapter 2. Past Life. Once inside, Michael took out his notebook. "Now tell me what happened," he said. "No one had come to visit for over 2 hours," said Joan Potts. "It was a slow day." Lottie Bingley sat down behind the reception desk. "I'm afraid I left the reception," she said. "Every year we have a competition for artists. People from all over Lancashire send in their paintings. This morning we had some new paintings come in, and I was very excited. I wanted to see them, even though it's not my job to unpack them. I went upstairs to look. While I was gone, someone came in and stole one of our paintings. So it's all my fault." Michael looked all around the room. "Don't you have security cameras?" he asked. "No," Joan replied. "It would cost a lot of money. But we never imagined that someone would steal from the Oswald Gallery." "And neither of you saw anybody?" Michael asked. "No," both women replied at the same time. "We didn't see or hear anything," said Lottie. "Let's have a look at where the painting was hung," Michael said. The women led him into one of the gallery's little rooms. Modern galleries had lots of space and white paint, but the Oswald Gallery was different. The building had many small rooms and halls. The walls were covered in beautiful old wood. The windows were very small. As visitors walked around, they could imagine living 300 years ago. Paintings were hung on all the walls, but in one place there was an empty spot. "It was here," said Joan. "It was called Summer." Michael took out his phone. "I'm going to call the crime scene police," he told Joan and Lottie. "Someone will come round and check for fingerprints. I'll also need a photograph of the painting, please. It'll help in the investigation." "I'll go and find one," said Lottie. "The artist was Butterworth, of course." The Oswald Gallery was small and not very important, but it had the largest collection of Butterworth paintings in the country. Tristan Butterworth was a famous painter from the 1940s and 50s. He had lived near Pendle Lee for many years. When he died in the 1980s, many of his best paintings were given to the gallery. People came from all over the United Kingdom to see them. Lottie came back into the reception and handed a large photograph to Michael. "Here it is," she said. "Summer. It's a wonderful picture, isn't it?" Michael looked at it. It showed a beautiful summer scene. In the background, the sun shone on a river. Green fields and trees were all around. In the front of the painting, there was a large tree, and under it sat a young woman. She was wearing an old-fashioned yellow dress and a big hat. "This was painted in 1951, Lottie said. "Looking at it makes me feel so calm. It almost feels like you're really there." "It's lovely," said Michael. "I'll need to keep this photograph for our investigation. Is that okay?" "Of course," said Lottie. "We'll do whatever we can to help." Back inside his car, Michael phoned his boss, Chief Inspector Blake. He gave Blake all the information he had so far. The inspector was very busy. Michael could tell he wasn't very interested in a painting stolen from a village gallery. The city had more crime than the police could deal with. "They should have had security cameras," Blake said angrily. He told Michael to contact the Art Loss Register. It kept an international database of art that had been stolen or lost. If a rich person or museum wanted to buy a piece of art, they could find out if it was stolen through the register. If it was, the buyer could alert the police. The thief, who was trying to sell the art, could then be caught. It was hard to find stolen art. Sometimes the buyer knew it was stolen, but didn't care. Sometimes a group of thieves would plan a big burglary and then wait for many years before selling the art in places like Africa or South America. "Can you deal with this?" Blake asked Michael. "I don't have another officer who can come down there right now. It's too bad we have to send you a crime scene officer just to take some fingerprints." "I still think it's a good idea," Michael said. The inspector was often in a bad mood, and Michael was glad he didn't have to work in the city with him. "You know we're on terror alert, don't you?" Blake went on. "We may have to send officers to Manchester or London at any moment. You too, Sergeant." "I know," Michael replied. "Leave everything to me, Inspector. I'll send you my reports." After the phone call was finished, Michael opened the car window. He took a deep breath of fresh air. Then he looked at the photograph of Summer again. The young woman in the picture was very pretty. She had long, wavy blonde hair. She looked out across the fields. Michael wondered if the woman had been real or if she had come from the painter's imagination. Michael was soon back at the station. He immediately contacted the Art Loss Register. He informed them about the stolen painting and gave all the details. Then he went out and interviewed the villagers. He was hoping someone had seen something strange, like someone hurrying away from the village. Meanwhile, the crime scene officer was exploring the gallery. If fingerprints were found, they would be put into the police fingerprint database. If the thief had done anything wrong before, his or her prints would be in the database. They would match with the prints from the crime scene. Then the police would have a name. Over the next 2 days, Michael was busy. He put up signs about the burglary. The signs asked people with any information to call the police or the National Crime Stoppers number. He also went from house to house, asking the villagers if they had seen a stranger in the village. A few couples and families had had picnics or had stopped at the White Witch pub. But nobody had been behaving strangely. He made copies of the Summer photograph. Then he took them to all the art shops and auction houses in the area